The Fog by Jonathan Peters. It was 10:05 p.m. on an unusual balmy Saturday night in Albuquerque, New Mexico. John T. Pizer was sweeping out the back storage room at Ridley's Pizzeria on Washington Street. The restaurant had just closed, but the cleanup was just beginning. Pizer liked working at the pizzeria. He liked making pizzas and he liked staying busy, which he did because the restaurant was a popular place with the college crowd. He also liked his co-workers, except for the night supervisor Chris, who smelled like 2-day-old pepperoni and always made him clean out the back storage room after they closed. He really liked Janice Nicole, one reason being that she had 2 first names, the other reason being her sizable breast and the way her ass swayed when she walked. Tonight's shift had been a slow one, even though they were busy. It was slow because Pizer was impatient for it to be over, and with good reason. He and his best friend and co-worker Rick were going urban exploring, and even better, Janice Nicole had agreed to go with them. "Hey John," Janice said, sauntering up to him as he bussed one of the tables earlier that night. She was the only person in the restaurant that called him by his first name, and he liked that. "What's up, Jay?" He was the only one that called her Jay, and he thought she liked that too. "Get this table bussed so that we can get the show on the road," she said, teasing Pizer. His cheeks reddened and he hurriedly threw 2 cups still full of Pepsi into the bus tub. Pizer and Rick had been urban exploring for the past 6 months. Their fascination with it began after watching YouTube videos of a young Russian kid who traveled all over Eastern Europe to explore dilapidated buildings, railway stations, forgotten military silos, and every sort of abode that he could find. And while Albuquerque didn't have the history or radiation of a place like Chernobyl, it did have one thing worth exploring: an abandoned mall, which is exactly where Pizer, Rick, and Janice were going after they finished their shift at the pizza parlor. All right, Pizer said, feigning irritation. "Why don't you help instead of just standing there like the pizza dictator you think you are?" "Hail pizza," Janice said, beaming a big white smile at Pizer before walking off. Pizer doubled over laughing. Janice's ability to offer up off-color jokes was another reason he crushed on her so hard. He didn't know another girl like her. Pizer watched Janice walk back into the kitchen, his heart pounding with lust. He wasn't the only one. Chris, standing near the registers, not so surreptitiously, snuck a glance at her behind as she strolled by him on her way to the kitchen. Pizer frowned. Yet another reason not to like Chris. He tried not to be jealous when other guys were giving Janice attention, but his emotions often got the best of him when it came to his crush. "Hey, Pizer, catch," came Rick's voice from somewhere to his right. Before he could react, a wet towel slapped him across the neck, followed by Rick's cackling laugh. Pizer grabbed the towel, spotted Rick near the side exit door, and hurled the towel back at him. It fell limply onto the floor, 10 feet short of its intended target. "That's enough," Chris said, puffing out his chest and crossing his arms. "Sure thing, Doughboy," Rick said under his breath. Rick called Chris Doughboy due to his pasty white skin and jelly-like stomach. He waited until Chris turned his back and then flipped him off. Pizer suppressed a laugh. They both finished bussing the tables before joining Janice back in the kitchen. Chris eyeballed them from the registers as they passed by. Pizer and Rick couldn't have looked more different. The former was tall and lanky with light brown hair that flopped over his forehead, and the latter was short and pudgy, with black hair that hung in loose curls below his shoulders. Yet they shared a similar sense of humor about life, especially when it came to making fun of Doughboy. They also shared a similar sense of wanderlust. They were set to graduate in just a few months, and neither could get out of high school fast enough. They didn't know what they wanted to do afterward, but they knew it involved getting out of Albuquerque and making YouTube videos. "Help with these dishes so we can get out of here," Janice said, as they made their way into the kitchen, Rick putting Pizer in a headlock as they walked up to her. Pizer easily slipped it and nudged Rick in the shoulder. Rick pushed him back, and before Janice could get out another word, they were wrestling on the floor. This was a nightly occurrence. "If you don't stop, I'm not going with you tonight," Janice said, sounding more like their mother than their friend. "Come on, Pizer," she said, hands on hips. Using his last name meant she was unhappy with him, and Pizer couldn't have that. He brushed Rick off and immediately began shoving forks from the sink into the dishwasher. Rick, smiling to himself and shaking his head, grabbed the dish bin that had just finished washing and began stacking plates to bring them to the front bar. "So tell me the plan," she said, as she handed Pizer a stack of greasy pizza pans. He hosed them down before throwing them in the commercial dishwasher, which would finish the wash in less than a minute. "We go in and explore, and that's about it," he said, scratching his nose as he waited for the washer to finish. Rick came back from the front of the restaurant and, having heard Janice Nicole's question, he joined in the conversation. "And don't get caught," he added helpfully. "Well, if the cops come, what do we do?" "Just follow us. We'll get you out safe," Pizer said. The dishwasher finished, and he threw open the door dramatically. "It's an abandoned mall," Rick said, as if that concluded the conversation on safety. "Just don't leave me," she said, and reached out and nudged Pizer in the ribs. "Never," Pizer said, blushing. He hadn't told Rick yet, but he hoped to get a few minutes alone with Janice tonight. He wanted to ask her out. He was almost certain she liked him as much as he liked her, but he was still nervous. Up until tonight, they had only ever been friends. He hoped to change that. He just needed to make sure it was the right time. Tonight, unlike so many other nights before, he promised himself that he would not wimp out. It was 11 o'clock before they finally walked out the side door of Ridley's Pizzeria and into the humid, oppressive night. Chris stopped in the parking lot for his usual post-work chat, which he attempted to force onto them every night, but the other three gave him a half-hearted good night and walked away before he could stall them. Chris then turned his attention to the cook, Alex, who, upon realizing he was the only one left, promptly took his phone out of his pocket and pretended to answer it. "Yeah, I'm coming home now, babe. See you soon," he said, and gave Chris an apologetic smile. Chris shrugged and then made off toward his green, beat-up Subaru Forester and whatever late-night adventures awaited him. "Whose car are we taking?" Janice asked, as the three of them stood next to her pink Toyota Supra. It was the slickest car in the lot, no matter what other cars were parked there. "I don't want to leave my car at an abandoned mall. It'll be safer in this parking lot. I can pick it up afterward." Pizer and Rick agreed. Rick's two-seater Nissan pickup truck wasn't an option for the three of them, so that left Pizer's hand-me-down Toyota Camry. "Nobody will steal that thing at the mall," Rick teased. "Let's hope nobody else is at the mall," Pizer said. The mall was a 15-minute drive from the pizza parlor. The soft yellow streetlights whizzed by. They miraculously caught almost all greens on their way to the mall. The mall itself was a bleeding dark mass surrounded by the glow of the city. The only lights were the few in the parking lot. They drove around the entirety of the mall to make sure that there were no security guards. They didn't see any. They parked underneath an oak tree near the back of the lot, facing the Sears department store. "Looks like the coast is clear," Janice said as they stepped out of Pizer's Camry, grabbing their backpacks in the process. "It's the coast is clear," Rick said. "I like ghost better," she said, and then turned to Pizer, terminating the discussion. "Ready when you are." They each had a flashlight, their phone, and Janice had brought water and trail mix for all three of them, even though Rick voiced his displeasure at the snack. "Gets my hands dirty," he said. "I like trail mix," Pizer had jumped in immediately afterward. "Sure you do," Rick said, smirking. Rick also carried a GoPro camera, which was presently clipped to the front of the helmet. "We're not going caving, are we?" Janice asked when she saw the camera. "Just makes it easier to record. Keeps my hands free." They approached the entrance to Sears. The windows were boarded up with thick plywood. Same for the doors. "How exactly are we supposed to get in here?" Janice asked. "With this," Rick said, and he pulled a crowbar out of his backpack. "You guys didn't tell me we'd be breaking into the mall," Janice said, frowning, her arms crossed. "No other way in, Jay," Pizer said apologetically. "Don't worry, people break into these places all the time. They put up new plywood every few weeks." Janice uncrossed her arms and Pizer grinned. She never stayed upset with him for long. Rick tapped his foot impatiently. "Let's just do this quickly then," she said, nodding at Rick and his crowbar. Rick stepped up to the window, the other two in quiet anticipation. Pizer and Janice stood lookout. The sound of creaking, splintering wood came next. In the dead quiet, in the black of night, the sound was deafening, and it went on forever. "Can you please hurry up?" Janice said, frantically looking up and down the parking lot, expecting security to come speeding around the corner at any moment. "I'm going as fast as I can," Rick said. Then he paused. "Pizer, get on the other end, will you?" "Sure thing." Pizer grabbed the crowbar from Rick and then pulled at the plywood on the other end. It creaked as it pulled away from the wall. Rick grabbed his side, which was hanging on only by the end of the nails that had kept it in place, and yanked as hard as he could. The plywood shook loose on his end as Pizer pulled on his. Eventually they wiggled the wood off the nails and tossed it on the ground. Despite their best efforts, it clattered on the concrete and the sound echoed off the walls of the building. Janice winced, looked at the window that stood intact behind where the plywood had been, and then groaned. "That's going to make some noise," she said. "We'll be as quiet—" Pizer was interrupted by an ear-splitting crack as Rick shattered the glass with his crowbar. "Jesus Christ," Janice said, holding her ears. "That'll wake every cop in the city." Pizer scanned the parking lot while Rick knocked out the remaining pieces of glass with the crowbar. Besides the cracking of the small pieces of glass as Rick tossed them on the ground, the rest of the mall was quiet. Rick finally finished picking out the glass. He took one look around him and then hopped inside the mall. "Ready?" Pizer asked. He wanted to throttle Rick for not finding a better and quieter way inside. He doubted Janice would ever come urban exploring with him again after this. To his surprise, she grinned broadly and jumped in after Rick without saying a word. Pizer shrugged to himself and then followed suit. The inside of the mall was so stifling hot that it took Janice's breath away. She inhaled deeply and then coughed once. "Sorry," she said, then coughed again into her shirt sleeve. "I can't see my hand in front of my face," she added. Rick's flashlight clicked on. Pizer and Janice's flashed on just a second later. The light shone to the entryway into Sears, endless rows of empty clothes racks to their left and right, shadows hidden in corners. The place smelled like stale cologne and mildew. Rick bumped into a clothes rack, shattered in the gloomy silence. Pizer jumped. Janice squealed. They froze, listening in the dark for any evidence that someone might have heard them. But after a moment, without any signs of life outside their own breathing, they relaxed. They were alone in the mall. They proceeded deeper into the department store, their flashlights the only light driving away the darkness. Rick had turned on his GoPro. Janice wiped sweat from her brow. "There's no air in here," she said. Pizer nodded in agreement, wiping his forehead with his shirt. Rick ignored the sweat dripping from his nose. "Where do we go from here?" Janice asked. Even though there were no signs of anyone else in the mall, she was still whispering. "Wherever we want," Pizer said. He reached out and squeezed her hand reassuringly, and then immediately pulled it back. He had never done that before, and wasn't sure how she would respond to his touch. He instantly regretted his decision, thinking he had made a grave mistake. Instead, Janice reached out and took his hand in hers, squeezing tightly, and she didn't let go. Pizer nervously swallowed, but squeezed her hand back. He hoped his palm wasn't too sweaty. Rick led them through Sears and into the heart of the mall. Pizer stopped to take in the spectacle. Their flashlights barely made a dent through the darkness, only highlighting the enormous cavern they had stepped into. The walls disappeared above them into blackness, and the heat pushed down onto their bodies like a living, angry animal. The smell of the department store was replaced by a sickly sweet, rotting odor. "What is that smell?" Janice asked, pulling her shirt over her nose. "Smells like feces," Pizer said, doing the same. "Could be homeless in here, using the place as their toilet," Rick said, and then, a second later, "Hey, the stairs, let's go up to the second floor." They crept up the stairs into a war zone. One department store, Seltzer's, entire front window was shattered. Chairs were strewn about on the walking path and a couch was overturned. It looked to Pizer as if a small bomb had gone off. Janice looked around in disbelief. Pizer gave her a shrug of his shoulders as if to say that he had no idea what could have happened here either. Rick picked up a chair and sat down. "Comfortable," he said, grinning and clasping his arms behind his head. The chair was black metal, and it didn't look comfortable to Pizer. But then they heard a loud crash, as if coming from glass breaking. It came from deep in the bowels of the mall, where nothing but shadows lived. The sound echoed throughout the mall and was followed by deafening silence. The three friends hardly breathed. "What was that?" Janice asked in a whisper. "Could be a rat," Rick said. He had bolted out of the chair after the crash and was now standing behind it, gripping the back like he was going to wield it as a weapon. "Must have been a big damn rat," Pizer said. "Maybe something just fell out of the ceiling," Rick offered, half-heartedly. "You know, the ceiling finally gave way and the air conditioner fell through it. It wouldn't be too unusual in an old building like this, right?" Pizer wasn't sure if Rick was trying to convince them or himself. "Let's go investigate," Rick said after they listened for more sound. "What if it's an intruder?" Janice asked. She was fidgeting with her flashlight, nervously turning it left and right and adjusting the brightness. "Pizer can handle them," Rick offered up cheerfully. Pizer slapped Rick in the shoulder. "Not funny." Pizer shone his light in the direction the sound came from. "There's three of us," he said. "We can handle whatever it is." Now it was Janice's turn to wonder who Pizer was trying to convince. "Let's go," she said, finally, grinning. "That's why we're here, to explore." Pizer and Rick grinned back at her. Pizer's heart fluttered. He thought Janice had the most amazing smile. Her lips were naturally plump, and she had the cutest incisors that, when she smiled, made her look slightly wolfish. They made their way down the long, dark hallway, careful to sidestep the glass on the floor. They inspected each store they walked past, shining their lights inside and onto empty shelves. Caleb's, a fishing gear store, still showcased a few spare fishing poles in the display case out front. Pizer was surprised nobody had broken into the store and stolen them. They finally came to the end of the northern section of the mall and, they presumed, the source of the crash they had heard earlier. However, there was no evidence of any disturbance. The mall dead-ended at a Kohl's department store, its tall windows as black as night. They flashed their lights through the windows, but the dark was too intense to see inside. They were about to walk back toward the center of the mall when Janice noticed a strange glow coming from underneath the main entrance door of Kohl's. She trained her flashlight on the substance. "Do you guys see that?" she asked. The glow was a fog coming through the crack beneath the door, and as they stared, bewildered, it grew until it billowed around them. "Is there a fire?" Rick asked, backing away from the thick green ooze. "Guys, we should get out of here," Janice said. She was also backing away from the fog, but before they knew it, they were almost fully enveloped by the mysterious green substance. Pizer took Janice's hand and attempted to draw her back toward where he thought the stairs were, but it was no use. The soup was so thick that he could barely see the whites of Janice's shocked, widening eyes. She squeezed his hand as if to say yes, she was still with him, but don't let go. "Look," Rick said. He was pointing back toward the door, which Pizer could barely see now. A figure cloaked in shadows stood near the entrance. Even though it was hard to see through the green haze, Pizer thought that the man, or more like just a shape of a man, was missing an arm, his shadow jagged at the edges as if he had been ripped apart by a shark. Suddenly behind the shape appeared another, and this time, as the fog emitted its strange, eerie green light, Pizer, with utter terror, saw that the man was missing half of his face, and what remained was nothing but pieces of sharp, shattered bone. The three of them were mesmerized and horrified by what they were witnessing. Slowly out of the fog materialized three more shadows, all man-shaped. The shapes stood unmoving, each more grotesque than the other. As the light from the fog glowed more intensely, Pizer saw that on the floor near the back of the pack was a man missing both legs, and through him now emitted a moan that rumbled through Pizer's bones as the man used his tattered hands to slowly crawl toward them. That was enough to break them out of their trance. Without saying a word to one another, they bolted for the stairs, Pizer keeping hold of Janice's hand. It was no use. They tumbled over each other in their haste to get away, and Rick, out in front, found the stairs, but as he was already falling over in the confusion, he tripped and rolled down them, his loose helmet and GoPro camera flying off. He struck his head on the hard metal and knocked himself out. He lay still, blood trickling from a cut on the back of his head, sprawled out on the landing between floors. Pizer and Janice were right behind him, both making it to the top of the stairs without falling over, although just barely. "Rick," Pizer called out, but before he could turn his attention to his friend's need, he felt something grip his upper arm. It was deadly cold and sent a shiver up into his brain. He froze, eyes wide, and looked at Janice. She too was frozen, as something had a hold of her as well, but not by the arm. Something had reached out and grabbed her ankle. She looked down and realized in horror that it was the legless man come to grab her. Janice screamed, and then her legs went out from under her as the legless man yanked hard. Her hand was wrenched away from Pizer, who was trying desperately to free his arm from the frozen grip of the shadow that held him. He looked up into the face of the man that held him and saw that the monster was missing one eye, and the other was lidless, a giant pale orb staring back at him. Pizer reared his fist back and decked the ghoul in the face, his hand smashing into exposed cheekbone. A strange, guttural sound emitted from the creature's throat, and it gave him a jagged, toothed smile. Pizer screamed now, forgetting all about Janice, who herself was screaming as she was being dragged back toward the entrance from which the green fog had originated. The chill coming from the claw that had a death grip on Pizer's arm had permeated his entire body. His strength was diminishing. His vision blurred, and his breath came ragged in his chest. He only had a few seconds before blackness enveloped him, and in that time he remembered that he had never gotten the chance to ask Janice to be his girlfriend. Now she was gone, lost somewhere in the fog, dragged away by a legless creature, and he was locked in a death grip with a grinning devil. "Janice," he screamed at last, but it was too late. The grip on his arm hardened and the ghoul leaned in close. Pizer could see rotten flesh in the broken teeth of the creature, and the smell emitting from the being's mouth was of decayed fish. Pizer, through his terror, finally wrenched his arm free and turned to go after Janice, but the foul mouth of the monster sunk his teeth into his neck, blood spurting from the jagged wound. The creature sucked hungrily from the hole in his neck, and the scream that originated from Pizer's mouth came out as nothing but a gurgle. His body sunk toward the floor as the life bled out of him, but the creature held tight and continued to suck at his neck until the darkness was complete. Rick stirred on the platform between the floors. He had been vaguely aware of his friend's screams, and now he was fully awake. His mind screamed for him to run. His intuition told him it was too late for his friends. He looked up to the second floor and saw a shape on the ground, and one of the creatures had it by the arm. He thought it might be Pizer, he wasn't sure, but he was certain that whichever of his friends that lay there was now dead, their lifeless body in the clutches of something far more sinister than his mind could conjure on its own. He finally stood up, his head pounding with pain, and, determined not to leave his friends behind, even if it was too late, dashed back up the stairs to the second floor. He was just in time to see another figure being dragged away and through the now open door of the department store. He thought it was Janice, but the figure was not moving nor making a sound. "Janice," he called out, but then, in his haste to get to her body, he stumbled over the body on the floor in front of him. He looked down and saw that it was Pizer, a gaping wound from his neck, blood pooling around his head. He bent down to inspect his friend, knowing in his heart that he was already gone, and then felt the cold claws of death on his own shoulders. It was his turn to scream, and as his shouts echoed throughout the dead silence of the mall, he was dragged away toward the entrance of Kohl's. He kicked and struggled with all his might, but the hands gripping his shoulders were too strong. Through the ghoulish fog, he could see his captor, the creature's head covered in a slimy ooze that leaked down to the half-rotten flesh of his face. The last thing Rick saw before being dragged into the department store, as he looked back toward the stairs, was the crumpled body of Pizer and the nearest ghoul dragging him toward where Rick was now, also being inexorably led. The pain in his shoulders from the claws that held him was excruciating, and he began to pass out again. His last thought was how it was a mercy that he would not be awake to feel whatever horrible fate awaited him inside the fog. The mall fell silent again with Rick's final scream as he was dragged away. The fog receded back inside the department store, and the doors closed on the three friends forever. The end.